people who are absolutist on free speech, which I happen to agree with, but they confuse free speech of an individual versus free speech for a computer. I am strongly in favor of free speech for every human. I am not in favor of free speech for computers. And the algorithms are not necessarily optimizing the best thing for humanity. And we're also going to have to change some of the laws, for example, Section 230, to allow for liability in the worst possible cases. So when someone is harmed from this technology, we need to have a solution to prevent further harm.
Eric, where does this podcast find you?
I'm in Boston. I'm at Harvard and giving a speech to students later today.
Oh, nice. So let's bust right into it. You have a new book out that you co-authored with the late Henry Kissinger titled Genesis, Artificial Intelligence, Hope and the Human Spirit. What is it about this book, or give us what you would call the pillars of insight here around that'll help people understand the evolution of AI?
Well, the world is full of stories about what AI can do, and we generally agree with those. What we believe, however, is the world is not ready for this. And there are so many examples, whether it's trust, military power, deception, economic power, the effect on humans, the effect on children, that are relatively poorly explored. So the reader of this book doesn't need to understand AI, but they need to be worried that this stuff is going to be unmanaged. Dr. Kissinger was very concerned that the future should not be left to people like myself. He believed very strongly that these tools are so powerful in terms of their effect on human society that it was important that the decisions be made by more than just the tech people. And the book is really a discussion about what happens to the structure of organizations, the structure of jobs, the structure of power, and all the things that people worry about. I personally believe that this will happen much, much more quickly than societies are ready for, including in the United States and China. It's happening very fast.
And what do you see as the real existential threats here? Is it that it becomes sentient? Is it misinformation, income inequality, loneliness? What do you think are the kind of first and foremost biggest concerns you have about this rapid evolution of AI?
There are many things to worry about. Before we say the bad things, let me remind you enormous improvements in drug capability for healthcare, solutions to climate change, better vehicles, huge discoveries in science, greater productivity for kind of everyone, a universal doctor, a universal educator. All of these things are coming. And those are fantastic. A long way you come with because these are very powerful, especially in the hands of an evil person, and we know evil exists. These systems can be used to harm large numbers of people. The most obvious one is their use in biology. Can these systems at some point in the future generate biological pathogens that could harm many, 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 many humans? Today, we're quite sure they can't, but there's a lot of people who think that they will be able to unless we take some action. Those actions are being worked on now. What about cyber attacks? You have a lone actor, a terrorist group, North Korea, whomever, whatever your evil person or group is, and they decide to take down the financial system using a previously unknown attack vector, so-called zero-day exploits. So the systems are so powerful that we are quite concerned that in addition to democracies using them for gains, dictators will use them to aggregate power, and they'll be used in a harmful and military context.
I'm freaked out about these AI girlfriends. I feel as if the biggest threat in the U.S. right now is loneliness that leads to extremism. And I see these AI girlfriends and AI searches popping up, and I see a lot of young men who have a lack of romantic or economic opportunities turning to AI girlfriends and begin to sequester from real relationships. And they become less likely to believe in climate change, more likely to engage in misogynistic content, sequester from school, their parents, work. In some, they become really shitty citizens. And I think young men are having so much trouble that this low risk entry into these faux relationships is just going to speedball loneliness and the externalities of loneliness. Your thoughts?
I completely agree. There's lots of evidence that there's now a problem with young men. In many cases, the path to success for young men has been shall we say, been made more difficult because they're not as educated as the women are now. Remember, there are more women in college than men, and many of the traditional paths are no longer as available. And so they turn to the online world for enjoyment and sustenance, but also because of the social media algorithms, they find like minded people who ultimately radicalize them either in a horrific way like terrorism or in the kind of way that you're describing, where they're just maladjusted. Um, this is a good example of an unexpected problem of existing technology. So now imagine that the AI girlfriend or boyfriend, but let's use AI girlfriend as an example, is perfect, perfect visually, perfect emotionally. And the AI girlfriend in this case captures your mind as a man to the point where she or whatever it is takes over the way you're thinking. You're obsessed with her. That kind of obsession is possible, especially for people who are not fully formed. Parents are going to have to be more involved for all the obvious reasons, but at the end of the day, parents can only control what their sons and daughters are doing within reason. We've ended up, again, using teenagers as an example. We have all sorts of rules about age of maturity, 16, 18, what have you, 21 in some cases. And yet you put a 12 or 13-year-old in front of one of these things, and they have access to every evil as well as every good in the world, and they're not ready to take it. So I think the general question of are you mature enough to handle it, sort of the general version of your AI girlfriend example, is unresolved.
So I think most people would agree that the pace of AI is scary and that our institutions and our ability to regulate are not keeping up with the pace of evolution here. And we see what happened with social around this. What can be done? What's an example or a construct or framework that you can point to where we get the good stuff, the drug discovery, the help with climate change, but attempt to screen out or at least put in check or put in some guardrails around the bad stuff? What are you advocating for?
I think it starts with having an honest conversation of where the problems come from. So you have people who are absolutist on free speech, which I happen to agree with, but they confuse free speech of an individual versus free speech for a computer. I am strongly in favor of free speech for every human. I am not in favor of free speech for computers. And the algorithms are not necessarily optimizing the best thing for humanity. So, as a general point, specifically, we're going to have some conversations about at what age are things appropriate. And we're also going to have to change some of the laws, for example, Section 230, to allow for liability in the worst possible cases. So when someone is harmed from this technology, we need to have a solution to prevent further harm. Every new invention has created harm. Think about cars, right? So cars used to hit everything and they were very unsafe. Now cars are really quite safe, certainly by comparison to anything in history. So the history of these inventions is that you allow for the greatness and you police technically the guardrails. You put limits on what they can do. And it's an appropriate debate, but it's one that we have to have now for this technology. I'm particularly concerned about the issue that you mentioned earlier about the effect of on human psyche. Dr. Kissinger, who studied Kant, was very concerned, and we write in the book at some length about what happens when your worldview is taken over by a computer as opposed to your friends, right? You're isolated. The computer is feeding you stuff. It's not optimized around human values, good or bad. God knows what it's trying to do. It's trying to make money or something. That's not a good answer.
So I think most reasonable people would say, okay, some sort of fossil fuels are a net good, I would argue. Pesticides are a net good, but we have emission standards and an FDA. Most people would, I think, loosely agree or mostly agree that some sort of regulation that keeps these things in check makes sense. Now, let's talk about big tech, which you were an instrumental player in. You guys figured out a way, quite frankly, to overrun Washington with lobbyists and avoid all reasonable regulation. Why are things going to be different now than what they were in your industry when you were involved in it?
Well, President Trump has indicated that he is likely to repeal the executive order that came out of President Biden. which was an attempt at this. So I think a fair prediction is that for the next 4 years, there'll be very little regulation in this area as the president will be focused on other things. So what will happen in those companies is if there is real harm, there's liability, there's lawsuits and things. So the companies are not completely scot free. Our companies, remember, are economic agents and they have lawyers whose jobs are to protect their intellectual property and their goals. So it's going to take, I'm sorry to say, it's likely to take some kind of a calamity to cause a change in regulation. And I remember when I was in California when I was younger, California licenses, the address on your driver's license was public. And there was a horrific crime where a woman was followed to her home and then she was murdered based on that information. And then they changed the law. And my reaction was, didn't you foresee this? Right? You put millions and millions of licensed information to the public, and you don't think that some idiot who's horrific is going to harm somebody. So my frustration is not that it will occur because I'm sure it will, but why did we not anticipate that as an example? We should anticipate, make a list of the biggest harms. I'll give you another example. These systems should not be allowed access to weapons. Very simple. You don't want the AI deciding when to launch a missile. You want the human to be responsible. And these kinds of sensible regulations are not complicated to state.
Are you familiar with character AI?
I am.
Really, just a horrific incident where a 14-year-old thinks he's establishes a relationship with an AI agent that he thinks is a character from Game of Thrones. He's obviously unwell, although my understanding is from his mother, who's taken this on as an issue, understandably. He did not qualify as someone who was mentally ill. Establishes this very deep relationship with obviously a very nuanced character. And the net effect is he contemplates suicide and she invites him to do that. And, the story does not end well. And my view, Eric, is that if we're waiting for people's critical thinking to show up or for the better angels of CEOs of companies that are there to make a profit, that's what they're supposed to do. They're doing their job. That we're just going to have tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. My sense is someone needs to go to jail. And in order to do that, we need to pass laws showing that if you're reckless with technology and we can reverse engineer it to the death of a 14-year-old, that you are criminally liable. But I don't see that happening. So I would push back on the notion that people need to think more critically. That would be lovely. I don't see that happening. I have no evidence that any CEO of a tech company is going to do anything but increase the value of their shares, which I understand and is a key component of capitalism. It feels like we need laws that either remove this liability shield. I mean, does any of this change until someone shows up in an orange jumpsuit?
I can tell you how we dealt with this at Google. We had a rule that in the morning we would look at things, and if there was something that looked like real harm, we would resolve it by noon and we would make the necessary adjustments. The example that you gave is horrific, but it's all too common. And it's going to get worse for the following reason. So now imagine you have a 2-year-old and you have the equivalent of a bear that is the 2-year-old's best friend. And every year the bear gets smarter and the 2-year-old gets smarter too, becomes 3, 4, 5, and so forth. That now 15-year-old's best friend will not be a boy or a girl of the same age. It'll be a digital device. And such people, and highlighted in your terrible example, are highly suggestible. So either the people who are building the equivalent of that bear 10 years from now are going to be smart enough to never suggest harm, or they're going to get regulated and criminalized. Those are the choices. I used to say that the internet is really wonderful, but it's full of misinformation, and there's an off button for a reason, turn it off. I can't do that anymore. The internet is so intertwined in our daily lives, all of us, every one of us, for the good and bad, that we can't get out of the cesspool if we think it's a cesspool, and we can't make it better because it keeps coming at us. The industry, to answer your question, the industry is optimized to maximize your attention and monetize it. So that behavior is going to continue. The question is, how do you manage the extreme cases? Anything involving personal harm of the nature that you're describing will be regulated one way or the other.
Yeah, at some point, it's just the damage we incur until then, right? We've
Yeah.
had 40 congressional hearings on child safety and social media, and we've had 0 laws.
In fairness to that, there is a very, very extensive set of laws around child sexual abuse, which is obviously horrific as well. And those laws are universally implemented and well adhered to. So we do have examples where everyone agrees what the harm is. I think all of us would agree that a suicide of a teenager is not okay. And so regulating the industry so it doesn't generate that message strikes me as a no-brainer. The ones which will be much harder are where the system has essentially captured the emotions of the person and is feeding them back to the person as opposed to making suggestions. And we talk about this in the book. When the system is shaping your thinking, you are being shaped by a computer, you're not shaping it. And because these systems are so powerful, we worry, and again, we talk about this in the book, of the impact on the perception of truth and of society. Who am I? What do I do? And ultimately, one of the risks here, if we don't get this under control, is that we will be the dogs to the powerful AI, as opposed to us telling the AI what to do. A simple answer to the question of when is the industry believes that within 5 to 10 years, these systems will be so powerful that they might be able to do self-learning. And this is a point where the system begins to have its own actions, its own volition. It's called a volition. It's called general intelligence, AGI as it's called. And the arrival of AGI will need to be regulated.
We'll be right back. We know that social media and a lot of these platforms and apps and time on phone is just not a good idea. I'm curious what you think of my colleagues were, Jonathan Haidt, and that is there any reason for anyone under the age of 14 to have a smartphone? And is there any reason for anyone under the age of 16 to be on social media? Should we age gate pornography, alcohol, the military? Shouldn't we, specifically the device makers and the operating systems, including your old firm, shouldn't they get in the business of age gating?
They should. And indeed, Jonathan's work is incredible. He and I wrote an article together 2 years ago, which called for a number of things in the area of regulating social media. And we start with changing a law called COPA from 13 to 16. And we are quite convinced that using various techniques, we can determine the age of the person with a little
Sure.
bit of work.
Yeah.
And so people say, well, you can't implement it. Well, that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. And so we believe that at least the pernicious effects of this technology on below 16 can be addressed. When I think about all of this, to me, we want children to be able to grow up and grow up in with humans as friends. And I'm sure with the power of AI arrival that you're going to see a lot of regulation about child content. What can a child below 16 see? This does not answer the question of what do you do with the 20-year-old, right, who's also still being shaped. And as we know, men develop a little bit later than women. And so let's focus on the underdeveloped man who's having trouble in college or what have you. What do we do with them? And that question remains open.
In terms of the idea that the genie is out of the bottle here, and we face a very real issue or fulcrum or tension, and that is we want to regulate it, we want to put in guardrails. At the same time, we want to let our sprinters and our IP and our minds and our universities and our incredible for-profit machine, we want to let it run, right? And the fear is that if you regulate it too much, the Chinese or, the Islamic Republic isn't quite as concerned and gets ahead of us on this technology. How do you balance that tension?
So there are quite a few people in the industry, along with myself, who are working on this. And the general idea is relatively light regulation, looking for the extreme cases. So the extreme events would be a biological attack, a cyber attack, something that harmed a lot of people, as opposed to a single individual, which is always a tragedy. Any misuse of these in war, any of those kinds of things we worry a lot about. And there's a lot of questions here. One of them is, do you think that if we had a AGI system that developed a way to kill all of the soldiers from the opposition in one day that it would be used? And I think the answer from a military general perspective would be yes. The next question is, do you think that the North Koreans, for example, or the Chinese would obey the same rules about when to apply that? And the answer is no one believes that they would do it safely and carefully under the way the US law would require. US law has a law called person in the loop or meaningful human control that tries to keep these things from going out of hand. So what I actually think is that we don't have a theory of deterrence with these new tools. We don't know how to deal with the spread of them. And the simple example, and sorry for the diversion for a sec, but there's closed source and open source. Closed is like you can use it, but the software and the numbers are not available. There are other systems called open source where everything is published. China now has two of what appear to be the most powerful models ever made, and they're completely open. And we're obviously, you and I are not in China, and I don't know why China made a decision to release them, but surely evil groups and so forth will start to use those. Now, maybe they don't speak Chinese or what have you, or maybe the Chinese just discount the risk. But there's a real risk of proliferation of systems in the hands of terrorism. And the proliferation is not going to occur by misusing Microsoft or Google or what have you. It's going to be by making their own servers in the dark web. And an example, a worry that we all have is exfiltration of the models. I'll give you an example. Google or Microsoft or OpenAI spends $200 million or something to build one of these models. They're very powerful. And then some evil actor manages to exfiltrate it out of those companies and put it on the dark web. We have no theory of what to do when that occurs because we don't control the dark web. We don't know how to detect it and so forth. In the book, we talk about this and say that eventually the network systems globally will have fairly sophisticated supervision systems that will watch for this because it's another example of proliferation. It's analogous to the spread of enriched uranium. If anyone tried to do that, there's an awful lot of monitoring systems that would say, you have to stop right now or we're going to shoot you.
So you make a really cogent argument for the kind of existential threat here, the weaponization of AI by bad actors. And we have faced similar issues before. My understanding is there are multilateral treaties around bioweapons, or we have nuclear arms treaties. So, is this the point in time where people such as yourself and our defense infrastructure should be thinking about or trying to figure out multilateral agreements? And again, the hard part there is my understanding is it's very hard to monitor things like this. And should we have something along the lines of Interpol that's basically policing this and then fighting fire with fire using AI to go out and find scenarios where things look very ugly and move in with some sort of international force? It feels like a time for some sort of multinational cooperation is upon us. Your thoughts?
We agree with you, and in the book, we specifically talk about this in a historical context of the nuclear weapons regime, which Dr. Kissinger, as you know, invented largely. What's interesting is working with him, you realize how long it took for the full solution to occur. America used the bomb in 1945. Russia or Soviet Union demonstrated it in 1949. So that's roughly that was a 4-year gap, and then there was sort of a real arms race. And once that, it took roughly 15 years for an agreement to come for limitations on these things, during which time we were busy making an enormous number of weapons, which ultimately were a mistake, including, these enormous bombs that were unnecessary. And so things got out of hand. In our case, I think what you're saying is very important that we start now. And here's where I would start. I would start with a treaty that says we're not going to allow anyone who's a signatory of this treaty to have automatic weapon systems. And by automatic weapons, I don't mean automated, I mean ones that make the decision on their own. So, an agreement that any use of AI of any kind in a conflict sense has to be owned and authorized by a human being who is authorized to make that decision. That would be a simple example. Another thing that you could do as part of that is say that you have a duty to inform when you're testing one of these systems in case it gets out of hand. Now, whether these treaties can be agreed to, I don't know. Remember that it was the horror of nuclear war that got people to the table, and it still took 15 years. I don't want us to go through an analogous bad incident involving an evil actor, North Korea. Again, I'm just using them as bad examples, or even Russia today. We obviously don't trust. I don't want to run that experiment and have all that harm and then say, hey, we should have foreseen this.
Well, my sense is when we are better at technology, we're not in a hurry for a multilateral treaty, right? When we're under the impression that our nuclear scientists are better than remember, our Nazis are smarter than your Nazis kind of thing, that we don't want a multilateral treaty because we see advantage. And curious if you agree with this, we have better AI than anyone else. Does that get in the way of a treaty, or should we be doing this from a position of strength? And also, if there's a number two, and maybe you think we're not the number one, but assuming you think that the US is number one in this, who is the number two? Who do you think poses the biggest threat? Is it their technology or their intentions or both? If you were to hear that one of these really awful things took place, who would you think most likely are the most likely actors behind it? Is it a rogue state? Is it a terrorist group? Is it a nation state?
First place, I think that the short-term threats are from rogue states and from terrorism. And because there, as we know, there's plenty of groups that seek harm against the elites in any country. Today, the competitive environment is very clear that the US, with our partner UK, I'll give you an example. This week, there were two libraries from China that were released, open source. One is a problem solver that's very powerful, and another one is a large language model that's equal, and in some cases exceeds the one from Meta, with which they use every day. It's called Llama 3, 400 billion. I was shocked when I read this because I had assumed that in my conversation with the Chinese, that they were 2 to 3 years late. It looks to me like it's within a year now. So it'd be fair to say it's the US and then China within a year's time. Everyone else is well behind. Now, I'm not suggesting that China will launch a rogue attack against an American city, but I am alleging that it's possible that a third party could steal from China because it's open source, or from the US if they're malevolent, and do that. So the threat escalation matrix goes up with every improvement. Now, today, the primary use of these tools is to sow misinformation, which is what you talked about. But remember that there's a transition to agents, and the agents do things. So it's a travel agent, or it's, whatever. And the agents speak English, that you give them English, and they respond in English. So you can concatenate them. You can literally put agent one talks to agent two, talks to agent three, talks to agent four. And there's a scheduler that makes them all work together. And so, for example, you could say to these agents, design me the most beautiful building in the world. Go ahead and file all the permits, negotiate the fees of the builders, and tell me how much it's going to cost, and tell my accountant that I need that amount of money. That's the command. So think about that. Think about the agency, the ability to put an integrated solution that today takes 100 people who are very talented, and you can do it by one command. So that acceleration of power could also be misused. I'll give you another example. You were talking earlier about the impact on social media. I saw a demonstration in England, in fact. The first command was build a profile of a woman who's 25, she has two kids, and she has the following strange beliefs. And the system wrote the code and created a fake persona that existed on that particular social media case. Then the next command was take that person and modify that person into every possible stereotype, every race, sex, so forth and so on, age, demographic thing, with similar views, and populate that. And 10,000 people popped up just like that. So if you wanted, for example, today, this is true today, if you wanted to create a community of 10,000 fake influencers to say, for example, that smoking doesn't cause cancer, which, as we know, is not true, you could do it. And one person with a PC can do this. Imagine when the AIs are far, far more powerful than they are today.
So one of the things that Dr. Kissinger was known for, and quite frankly, I appreciate, was this notion of realpolitik. That obviously, we have aspirations around the way the world should be, but as it relates to decision making, we're also going to be very cognizant of the way the world is and make some. I mean, he's credited with a lot of very controversial slash difficult decisions, depending on how you look at it. What I'm hearing you say leads all these roads lead to one place in my kind of quote unquote critical thinking or lack thereof brain, and that is there's a lot of incentive to kiss and make up with China and partner around this stuff. That if China and the US came to an agreement around what they were going to do or not do, and bilaterally created a security force and agreed not to sponsor proxy agents against the West or each other, that we'd have a lot, that would be a lot of progress. That might be 50, 60, 80% of the whole shooting match, is if the two of us could say, we're going to figure out a way to trust each other on this issue, and we're going to fight the bad guys together on this stuff. Your thoughts?
So Dr. Kissinger, of course, was the world's expert in China. He opened up China, which is one of his greatest achievements. And but he was also a proud American, and he understood that China could go one way or the other. His view on China was that China, and he wrote a whole book on this, was that China wanted to be the Middle Kingdom as part of their history, where they'd sort of dominated all the other countries. But it's not like America. His view was they wanted to make sure the other countries would show fealty to China, in other words, do what they wanted. And occasionally, if they didn't do something, China would then extract some payment, such as invading the country. That's roughly what Henry would say. So he was a very much a realist about China as well. His view would be at odds today with Trump's view and the US government's. The US government is completely organized today around decoupling, that is literally separating. And his view, which I can report accurately because I went to China with him, was that we're never going to be great friends, but we have to learn how to coexist. And that means detailed discussions on every issue at great length to make sure that we don't alarm each other or frighten each other. His further concern was not that President Xi would wake up tomorrow and invade Taiwan, but that you would start with an accident and then there would be an escalatory ladder. And that because the emotions on both sides, you'd end up just like in World War I, which started with a shooting in Sarajevo, that ultimately people found in a few months that they were in a world war that they did not want and did not expect. And once you're in the war, you have to fight. So the concern with China would be roughly that we are codependent and we're not best friends. Being dependent is probably better than being completely independent, that is non-dependent, because it forces some level of understanding and communication.
Eric Schmidt is a technologist, entrepreneur, and philanthropist. In 2021, he founded the Special Competitive Studies Project, a nonprofit initiative to strengthen America's long-term competitiveness in AI and technology more broadly. Before that, Eric served as Google's chief executive officer and chairman, and later as executive chairman and technical advisor. He joins us from Boston. Eric, in addition to your intelligence, I get the sense your heart's in the right place and you're using your human and financial capital to try and make the world a better place. Really appreciate you and your work.